webinar. We're going to do something slightly different today. So we should have around about 50 minutes input from Christine. Thanks, Christine. And we're basing the webinar around the questions that you bring in during the session. So the slightly different thing is to try and make it more interactive. Two little things. One is please hit chat to everyone. You're unable to do that, or directly to me, whichever you prefer. I will, as it were, harvest the questions and then collate them for Christine after her input. And then secondly, I will try and call on people to ask their question, because so it's slightly less of a just me and Christine essentially, and get you more involved. So without further ado, let me introduce Christine. Christine, thank you ever so much for doing this. Christine Armstrong writes, researches and speaks about issues such as working hours, productivity and the gender pay gap. An expert opinion former on balancing work and parenting. She's the author of The Mother of All Jobs. Great title. So Christine, over to you, and we'll pick up the questions afterwards, as I say. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Richard. Just to warn you that in keeping with the theme, thank you, Fiona, my children are currently having a recorder lesson. So if you can hear alive-o, cockles and mussels drifting through the room, I can only apologise. I've moved them as far away as I know how to. So I'm a researcher at core, and what I mostly do is sort of go into businesses, help understand what's going on by having conversations with people and looking at data and then trying to solve problems. And a lot of what I was doing pre-corona was looking at the gap between things that we intend and hope from flexible work and the things that actually happen and trying to resolve that. But when it became clear that a lot of people were going to be working from home and also looking after their children at the minimum, possibly schooling their children, depending on their interpretation of what's going on. A lot of people called and said, what have you got? What are you thinking about? And so in the last sort of 4 weeks, I kind of ended up doing sort of webinars like this, but webinars for individual companies, or writing memos, or doing client content, video content that they can use to support working parents. And I was thinking about what would be most useful for me to share with you today. And Richard kind of mentioned when we were speaking, are you going to go into practical advice for being at home with children? And I'm really happy to do that if that's what you put into your questions. I'm not going to start there, only because 4 weeks ago there wasn't much advice, and I was gathering it up from America and Hong Kong and other places that were further ahead than us. But now lots of people have been doing this for 4 weeks, and anything that's not very specific to the household issues tends to be a bit bland. So if you've got specific questions, send them into Richard and we'll look at them. I'm going to talk about 3 different things to get us started, and then you take it where you want. The first one, which I think is a framework that I found helpful and comes from somebody that I know well in Hong Kong who runs a big team, which is not parenting specific, but just a thought on the emotional journey that people are going through with the virus and with lockdown. And the difference with Hong Kong is they've either been locked down or restricted, severely restricted since January. So they're further along in the process than we are. And Karen's observation was that lockdown tends to start with a frenzy of activity. And we all kind of very high adrenaline, very productive, dealing with change, quite excitable, but also probably very anxious. And I remember that phase pretty well, maybe some of you do as well. That's often followed by a slump, a phase of really low energy and low productivity, where people feel really quite down and quite anxious. And people who have underlying anxieties, mental health issues, perhaps drink a bit, that's a moment of a real wobble, and they may keep returning to that phase later. And what she says, which I find encouraging, is that we tend to come out of that, the people she sees around it come out of that into sort of an adjustment and acceptance of the way things are, which is a return to productivity and the ability to be able to get on and get things done, and a more stable phase, a more stable managed energy level than the first 2. Obviously people can slide backwards, so be aware of that. And after this phase would come some sort of emergence from this whole phase as we go back to normal life, and or whatever version that is, but I don't think we need to dwell on that today. I think for the purposes of this conversation and parenting, the challenge is that at the same time that the sort of research I'm doing is telling me lots of people are coming out of slumping and starting to feel a bit better and more productive and want to be engaged with work, is today is the day that lots of schools have gone back, and lots of people are feeling enormous psychological pressure to also homeschool their children. And I think it's an obvious point, but one that's just worth turning our mind to, whether you have children or not, is just the pressure of trying to do two things that you care about at the same time, neither of which you can do as well as you want to, is quite an exquisite and special sort of pain. And a sort of a stress level that we are unused to and feels unfamiliar. And so I did a very quick survey. I'm happy to share the results with you over the last couple of days. And I've asked parents who also have a job what their level of stress is if they've got children at home. And more than 50% on a scale of 1 to 10 on stress levels are coming out as 7 or 8 on stress. So quite a lot of them are really feeling quite stressed by this combination. So that's the first thing, is just to think about that journey and then to overlay it with the particular pressures of education, schooling, nurseries, etc. The second thing to bear in mind, sort of as you're looking at it from a leadership, HR, management perspective, is who's in your teams, who are you dealing with, what are their particular problems? And the most sort of obvious way to look at that is to maybe start with what's the child to adult ratio in a household. So if you're looking, you might say, well, you know, in this household over here, we've got 2 parents, all right, they're both working, they've got 1 child between them, they might be okay. And over here, we've perhaps got a single parent with 3 kids, probably they're going to be under an enormous amount of pressure. How is that going to work? I think what I'm finding is that it's just very, very much more complicated than that. So this weekend I was talking to an HR person actually working in Ireland. Her partner's been furloughed. So you might look at that and go, okay, they've got 1 parent who's now not working who can look after the children, except that he's never been the anchor parent. And so appears, in her view, certainly not to have the skills to manage their children. The house is in chaos. The children are invading her constantly. She's trying to hold down a full-time job. She earns about 1/3 of the household income. So now they're very worried about money. And there's an enormous amount of pressure in that household. And I think you can probably guess that their relationship isn't flourishing right now. So, you know, you can sort of look at it from the outside, but actually you need to understand a little bit about what's going on. The other thing to just bear in mind before I go on is that some parents are absolutely fine. You know, Fiona, I think it was said before we started, you know, some people have asked to be furloughed and have been and are really enjoying, if there is a parent in the household who's been furloughed, who's got the time being at home and being with their kids. So that's also possible. So I just didn't want to overstate that everybody's really, really stressed. Some people are. In terms of those households, the next thing to think about is what's the age and combination of the children. I would throw in special needs as something you'd want to be looking out for and you'd want managers to have some awareness of. Very small babies can go either way. So a relatively relaxed parent or pick up, can put down, not too bad. Toddlers or an unhappy baby are very difficult, pretty much whatever your household structure. And where you've got toddlers in a household, even if you've got 2 parents, you're looking at half-day timetabling, possibly 2-hour slots, although most people have told me that they've given up with that because it doesn't work. Some people have gone to alternate days that they're working and working over a 6-day week. But those people are reporting really high levels of stress. They're really frazzled. They're concerned about the kids picking up on the stress. There's quite a lot going on there. Primary school kids, it varies. You know, there are 8-year-olds that will sit down and do quite a bit of work independently, watch a bit of telly, run around the garden and be happy. And there are 8-year-olds who won't leave you alone for 2.5 seconds. So you've got a mix there, and you've got a mix of moods. Teenagers ought to be all right, you would think, and many of them will just get on with their social media and do stuff, so the parents might be fine, except that the one thing that I'm hearing again and again is huge emotional volatility. They're feeling excluded from their friends. They're missing out on key rites of passage in terms of exams they may have worked hard for, may not have worked hard for, depending on who you're asking. But, you know, they sort of feel very frustrated and trapped and are kind of raging against that a bit. And so those parents are often feeling very concerned about them. And I would also just throw in college-age children or university who may have come home and may also be feeling pretty miserable that they're missing their friends, they're missing whatever activities they're into, they're stuck with their mum and dad like their kids, they're all fighting for space, they're all fighting for crappy Wi-Fi service, you know, and feeling quite frustrated as well. So I think just as an awareness point for managers and team leaders is to kind of have a bit of insight into what's going on in individual households. I think the third sort of area to think about is how does this play out in terms of your organisation? And when you're thinking about your talent pool, when you're thinking about productivity, when you're thinking about culture and what happens next, what's going on here? And I do two kinds of calls like this. I do some that are for individual companies where generally everybody's terribly polite, all the management's pretty supportive, or that's what you would read from it. And you know, there's generally a sort of good culture. There's probably a correlation between people who spend time on this and people who care about it, but whatever. But then I do network-based calls, perhaps similar to what Richard's doing here. And what I hear is very, very different, that there are lots of managers and team leaders who just don't get it, and they fall into, in the opinion of the person speaking, two camps. You've got people who just are oblivious. Maybe they thrived in a breadwinner model where they had a partner who was at home when their children were small, and so they just don't really fully appreciate the pressures that households are under. Maybe it's just not something that they've engaged with, maybe it's not something they're very interested in, or maybe it's just their management style. But things I hear are, you know, 3-hour Zoom calls going over lunch. Everybody's expecting the camera to be on the whole time, so they can't feed anyone. They can't be doing things in the background, which I'm imagining lots of the dark screens today, some of you are. Setting up breakfast calls, breakfast check-ins, a lot of socials that people feel pressured to be on. So just there's some sort of thought around awareness levels and how engagement is being pitched. I mean, somebody is that we set up the calls and I'm just always on calls, I'm not getting anything done. I think when you're adding in a complex household, people are even more raging that they can't get stuff done. Now, playing this forward is where I kind of want to leave this little introductory bit, is that when you think about what happens as this changes going forward, what's going to emerge on the other side? Because one of the concerns that some of those working parents are going to have is that they're going to be severely penalised for not being very productive during this period and for being stressed. They may, depending on your culture, they may or may not be open about how they're feeling about that pressure and how open they are about whether they're coping or not, or whether their partner is, or what particular things are going on. The next thing to bear in mind is when people do go back to work, who's going to be in your team and who do you want to be in your team? Because I think there's also, and the data is showing me this in terms of the survey, there are lots of people saying that this has changed the way that they live and it's changing the way they want to live. Now, there's a big group that are saying they want to get back to the office as soon as possible because they're going absolutely crackers. Their world is too small and they're not enjoying being at home with their kids and they can't wait for things to go back to normal. But there's another big group that's sort of rethinking that this is the most time they might have spent with their families, possibly since maternity leave. For some of them who've had a lot of childcare, possibly kind of ever, and suddenly they're in a slightly different world and they're rethinking, well, do I want to go back to long commutes, 12-hour days in the office? And then we're at the same time, we're reading reports saying public transport is going to be limited in terms of access. We're going to end up with big queues and not so many people being able to get on trains. What's going to come out of the other side of this? And who's going to be there on the other side? Are you inadvertently going to lose people that you might have wanted to keep in the team? Are some of the people not going to get to the end of this and just say, I can't do this, this isn't worth it, this is just too much? And are you going to be confronted with requests to work in really very different ways? William Hague did a webinar, I think Richard was on it as well 2 weeks ago, didn't he? He talked about this process, the virus being the great accelerator. So lots of things are changing faster. You know, we've talked about working differently and flexible work and work from home for years, and it's always been a second tier option. Is this going to change it? I don't know, and I'm not here to predict the future, but I think we will see people under different pressures, and I think there will be people who have surprised themselves how much they've appreciated being at home, who will now want to work differently. And I think for management and leadership teams, that's going to present some real challenges. And maybe one of the big challenges is going to be how we communicate that desire and that need to people who don't understand it, the people who are really, really happy to get back to the office. I'm just checking all of your names. I tend to call those people the Jeremies, which is not, I'm sorry if any of you are married to Jeremies or are friends to Jeremies or are Jeremies, only because it's just a name that always seems to pop up, but it's a shorthand of mine to the people who grew up in a breadwinner model for whom it worked really, really well, who don't understand necessarily some of the pressures, not through ill intent and not through any desire to be unsupportive, but just because it's not the way that their life has been organised until now. On which thought, I will hand over to Richard to see what you want to talk about.
Well, I'd love to hear some questions from people. Please don't have to, you don't have to type if you don't want to. You could just say me, and I'll hand over to you if that's easier. And while we wait for some of those to come in, I was going to ask you to say a little bit more, if possible, Christine, about the oblivious point. And the fact that possibly the bread, or how you deal with that. What's your advice for those who, for whatever reason, background or whatever, this isn't something they're not perhaps adjusting too well?
Yeah, so somebody that I have done work with has done a really nice project on this, which is one of the problems that HR or other people in the business who want to change that often express, is that I'm phrasing this really diplomatically. There are groups that don't necessarily want to confront some of their own biases. There are subjects they maybe don't want to discuss. They're terrified of saying the wrong thing. They don't want to appear to be politically incorrect. And so it can be sometimes quite difficult to have those conversations, and they can get quite brittle quite quickly. And this piece of work that I heard about that I'm really interested to explore more is in peer-to-peer mentoring between people who are not hugely, it's not the reverse mentoring we've all heard so much about, but just different life experiences at similar levels in the business, and having conversations. How does your day look? What pressures are you under? What's going on for you in a much smaller, safer environment? Obviously, there has to be a bit of mutual trust between the two people having that conversation, because it's very often that people assume that they understand it, and you'll get sort of, oh, I've had kids, I know what it's like. But when you probe a bit further, they haven't really spent time, you know, all day, all week, all month, face to face with kids, and that is quite a difficult experience. So I think quite a different experience. So I think there's a safety point. I think you've got to be able to try and set up some sort of safe conversations where people can understand it. And I'm going to add into that the evidence and the data. If you say, look, this is something that I'm seeing and I'm hearing, and this is a risk, and you know, this is how many people in our organisation are telling us that this isn't working for them. You know, a bit of IQ, a bit of EQ.
Excellent. I was going to ask you a little bit about danger signs as well if we have time, but let's come back to that, because Emma from KPMG has just asked the question. Thanks, Emma. So so she's very keen to hear your views on how we're going to help leaders give performance feedback during this challenging time for working parents. And if I can find Emma quickly, I'll unmute you, Emma, so that you can. Yeah, so it's a question about the performance feedback specifically for leaders.
Yeah. Well, I think for me, the thing which I would be really worried about in a large organisation is how aware are lots of your team leaders and the people giving your feedback on about the pressures other people are under. And they may be really aware, that may be the life that they're living and they totally get it, which is great. But you are very likely to have managers in there who don't get it at all, you know, and if they are just looking at productivity, you are likely to get messages back about lack of commitment, you know, weren't there in the key hours when this was really difficult, not delivering. And I think that's going to be so difficult for you to manage. You know, I think you need to think really carefully about how you're going to disseminate messages about expectations in the business, and how you're going to measure that, and how you're going to resolve things going forward. I mean, I know so many people on the calls which are not company run saying that they're being emailed, being asked to commit to 8 hours a day of being focused at their, that they're being asked to be focused between specific hours every day, and they're just sort of, with the absolute best of intentions, they're not able to do it. And I think there's a big risk that some of those people are going to throw in the towel if they have any financial security at all. They're just going to sort of, it's like that, it's also being torn up, and they're like, what am I doing this for? This is horrific. I'm not appreciated, I'm not valued, and it's a big impact on culture. So sorry, that was a bit dark, but when I hear the stuff out of the corporate zone, I do worry for this stuff.
Thanks, Christine. That's really helpful. I think it was just a very live example for me that came up on Friday, where I had an employee call me to ask if that was even something that our leaders should be doing at a time like this, given how hard, as you said, everybody's juggling that balance of those two really vital things in their life, their family and their job. And whilst they're doing everything within their power to do their best, to have a leader call them and say, here's some feedback / criticism at that point in time is really, really not helpful. So thank you for those views. That was really helpful.
Yeah, I think it is unhelpful. And I just think, I think it's just so hard if you're not in it day to day to appreciate how difficult it is to do it. I look like I'm totally calm here. I've got 3 kids downstairs. Obviously, I've told my husband he's not doing any work this afternoon because you're here. And he's running between 3 different rooms, and it's absolute mayhem. I can hear the music out here. I can hear a Zoom call down there. And I'm fine because I know he will deal with it, but I'm not on my own. And this is for a relatively short period where I've insisted that things are broadly under control. But in so many households, it's not under control. The house is a mess. And really practical stuff, it's stuff you can't say publicly. People haven't got the cleaning ladies, and they've never cleaned their own houses. I say it's like other people, like I have. You know what I mean? It's like, the house is a mess. The kids are feral. They're supposed to be schooling. Private schools, if you've got people in private schools, are particularly up against it, because to justify the fees, they put on these Zoom lessons all day, which is great if your kid will sit in front of the Zoom lesson all day. But if your kid is screaming around, unmuting themselves, interrupting the class, you feel you've got to sit over them. It's just adding to the pressure that people feel they're under.
I wonder if, whether at root of this, with the constant Zoom calls that some people are experiencing, it's almost like let's pretend that everything is going on just as normal, and there's also perhaps a lack of trust there, in the sense that they're putting in a structure to make sure people are sort of present, as it were.
Yeah, I think that there is that. I think you've got this real dichotomy though. So somebody mentioned in the setup, there are some people who've got more time than they've ever had, who are more determined to do more work and to fill their time because they've got the time. And then there are people who've got no time at all. And the two don't quite understand each other. And it's almost like you need to try and balance it out, but none of us can. A friend of mine who's single and trying to work said, I wish I could swap places with you for 2 days. I'm like, mate, you are not the only one. I think that it's hard to see into other people's households and get that.
We have a question from Bailey. Bailey, you're unmuted.
Hello, hi everyone. So the previous question was quite a nice segue into my question. So I work for a company called Metaswitch, who develop software and systems in the telecom space, and a large population of our workers are engineers, and they demand quite a specific and almost an algorithm to every approach. Now, dealing with situations like this, it's in the grey, and that isn't comfortable. But what are your recommendations on how to balance, exactly as you said, the need for managers to be flexible and sensitive for parents, but also the need for people and employees to still be productive and meet expectations?
I think you've got to be really honest, and it's all that psychological safety stuff. If people can't really tell you, if somebody says to you, look, genuinely, I can only really do 3 hours a day, what do you want me to do with it? At least you know where you're at. And I can't commit when that time's going to be. If they sleep in the morning, I'm going to do it before they get up. But if they wake up, I'm going to have to do it later in the day when they have a sleep. I think you've got to encourage people, and I know it's difficult with engineers, I'm married to one, that, you know, it's difficult, but you've got to have that conversation, because otherwise you're dealing with uncertainties. And that's one of my big things for you, is people are unlikely, unless they feel very safe, to bring this to you. They're likely to conceal their fears, their relationship problems. You know, my partner can't cope, my partner's a key worker, they're out all day, I can't put this on them as well. You know, there's a lot of vulnerability. And also, if they have not spent a lot of time with their children, and they have not, like the dad in Ireland, built the skills to manage their own kids necessarily, again, another difficult thing to say, then they're not really going to want to admit that. So I would say, for the engineering guys who are very kind of A-B, have the honest conversation. What are you able to do? What's realistic? Let's try that for a week. If it doesn't work, let's try something else. If you can't do it, we're almost better off knowing that and being honest about it. And also, I think for the parents, if you, I don't know to what extent you feel happy with sort of a bit of a therapy, but what pressure are they putting on themselves to homeschool? Because some people, I interviewed somebody last week on the phone on a Zoom. It was hysterical. She was doing a talk with me about how she was managing her kids, and all the time she kept shouting at her son, who's about 4, Adam, put down the razor. Adam, put down the razor. I'll give you a Skittle. Oh my God. So like, there's a huge range of people who are trying to be really, really controlled, and other houses where 3-year-olds are running around with razors and putting them down in exchange for sweets. So what's going on in that house? And is there a way to remove some of the pressure if they're really feeling they have to sit through every lesson, or the kid has to do every lesson? I mean, the WhatsApps, the parenting WhatsApps, I know some of you will be on them, but my God, 126 message about reception reading levels. And you're like, come on, they're all going to learn to read, it's going to be fine. But, you know, some parents will be really embedded in that. You've got to allow them to express that.
Does that help, Bailey?
She's on mute.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm going to turn to, thanks Bailey, and thank you Emma. So I'm just going to turn to Fiona now, Fiona Evans.
Hi.
Hiya.
I was really interested in what you were talking about right at the beginning. And this was about, you know, when you were talking about the frenzy of activity that people have faced over the last few weeks, and then this slump that people can fall into, and how we can support each other during that period, because I do think it's quite normal to have that. And I know towards the end of last week I felt like that myself. So and I haven't got you know, small children. I've got a 23-year-old working at home instead. But you know, I think it's tough if you've got children and working, and if you're feeling tired. And how do I support people during that process as well?
I find having the language helps people. If you say, look, you know, we've heard that there's sort of 3 or 4 phases, and there's a slump. Are you feeling you're in the slump? People will go, oh God, I'm so glad you said so, because I haven't been able to get out of bed for 3 days. So I do feel that releasing people and giving them a bit of language can really open it up and go, do you know what? I'm having a really shit week. I did loads the first 2 weeks. I was really productive. And now, honestly, I'm really struggling to focus. Somebody told me last week, it was like a real kind of alpha driver. She said, I got on my desk and I sat down and I looked at it for 2 hours and I barely did it. You know, I answered a few emails, didn't really do anything. Okay, let's just acknowledge that. We've all been through it. I certainly had a slump after Easter. So I would say be honest about it. And if you talk about yourself, maybe other people will open. And
Yes.
if you expect that's going on, you say, God, I don't know about you, but I've had a real slump. And they'll go, oh, so glad you said so. Don't you know, you've obviously...
No, but it's good that you said that there is a sort of framework, you know, a process that people are going through. I think that's really valuable.
Yeah, I find it helpful, because I find it sort of allows me to think, oh, it's all right, we're going to come out the other side of this. And then, you know, we'll move on, hopefully.
Okay, thank you.
Fiona, have you found, what have you done sort of yourself to lift that energy where you can?
Well, I think the most important thing was the first couple of weeks, I just never left my desk. I was just at it constantly, and I knew that I just couldn't keep doing that. So I've been making sure that I'd stop and have a break. I mean, I even, like at lunchtime, I go out in the garden and start weeding, but it's like, you know, just for 20 minutes, just to do something different. to try and get a bit of sun, get energy back, walk a dog, do something like that. But I think that there's almost that feeling that you have to prove that you're working all the time. Yeah. Where actually you are, and if you were at work, you would stop for a coffee, a chat, you would go and see people, you would not be tied to your desk from 7:30 in the morning till 6:30 at night. You just wouldn't. So I think it's about giving yourself permission to get up and say, hang on a minute, I need to go and do something different and have a different perspective, so that you can come back and actually give people the time and concentration that you need to. So I'm just trying to stop feeling guilty for getting up and doing something. I think that's what I've been doing anyway. I don't know what other people do, but that's what I'm doing.
There is just something definitely there about the mindset and the adjustment as well, isn't there? And as you say, you feel they're not working, but actually you are. This plays into very nicely, and thank you, Fiona, to Tracy Marshall's question. So Tracy, all yours.
Hello, thank you. I'm Tracy, I work for the REC. So I just wanted to ask, and Christine, you did touch on this already, but it was just regarding sort of flexible working and requests moving forward. So when we are all back to normal, hopefully whenever that may be, whatever normal is. But I feel like, I mean, we're a very flexible organisation anyway, but I feel as though when we do get back into the office, I feel as though we are going to get inundated with flexible working requests, you know, because people have been doing this for the last, you know, X amount of weeks. And I just feel that, you know, people are just going to want to do it more. So do you feel that, you know, because at the moment, you know, if somebody puts in a formal request, you know, you have the option to review it, and, you know, if you are going to reject it, you have to look at certain things. Do you feel that there's no argument now, because somebody could just turn around and say, well, I've done it successfully for the last 2 months, so why can't I do it? What are your thoughts on that? And
I think that's gonna be a huge cultural shift. And there's a piece in one of the New York magazines today about how they expect office space prices to crash because there's going to be so many requests for people to work remotely. I was forwarded just before lockdown a memo that a senior partner at a law firm had shared with his team, saying that he didn't see flexible working as acceptable, basically, as a very much a second option and to be used in emergencies. Well, nobody's going to be sending those memos now, are they? So you have to acknowledge that, you know, William Hague's great accelerator, I think, is here. And I think for organisations, this is the time to think, well, how are we going to manage that? What are going to be our minimum standards? How are we going to maintain culture? What are going to be our check-in points? You know, if people want to work remotely, well, okay, what are going to be the terms? I mean, I think on a very positive side, the research would suggest that people working more flexibly remotely some of the time increases their happiness and productivity. But if they do it all the time, some of the evidence suggests they lose energy, a bit of slumping, and become a bit disassociated, and become, you know, less sort of engaged in the organisation. So what kind of balances are you going to set up as normal? And how are you going to make sure that this doesn't become what flex has been, or it breaks out of what it's often been before, which is the B team? You know, the B team works flex, the mum team, the people who aren't going to get promoted, who aren't that committed, who don't get pay rises. How are you going to make it mainstream and supportive? Maybe this is a good moment to change that for the better. Maybe that's going to open up a talent pool to you. Maybe it's going to be easy to get the right kind of people. I think if you don't do that, you're potentially going to start losing what might well be the wrong people for you. I don't know. It depends how your teams are made up, but it could be that the people that you wanted to stay are not the ones that end up staying. It's the people who want to be in the office for 12 hours a day who do, and, you know, whether they're the right people for you or not, I don't know. But I think it's a big picture piece of research into your own teams. You know, what's going on in their heads, what do they want, and then how are you prepared to adapt to that? What are the limits of that? I think it is worth noting that, you know, some of the big companies who went all out for flex and remote working have pulled it back a bit, and for sometimes for cultural reasons. So there's a balance to be had. What's it going to be for your organisation?
Yeah.
What's your feeling, Tracy? How do you think it'll work?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, I mean, there are some people in my organisation who are going mad, can't wait to get back into the office, and don't ever want to work flexibly again.
Yeah, definitely.
Actually appreciate more than what they do, appreciate actually coming into work, getting on the train and being in the office.
Yeah.
Have got quite a lot of people who are the opposite, that actually, as you've already mentioned, have been spending time with their families, not having to get on the train, and actually are thinking, oh, do you know what, I could get used to this, I want more of this.
Yeah.
So I think you're right, recognizing, what is it that people want. Everyone is different, we're all individuals, we all have different needs, different things are important to us. So so no, I think that's really useful, and it's about analysing who you've got in your teams, what's important to them, and making a call on what's going to work for you as an organisation.
Yeah, and expecting that polarisation.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
I think we've got time for one more question. So while we just wait in case that comes in, and do feel free to just say me, and I'll go to you. Christine, I was wondering more about your point of your understanding what goes on in individual households. That seems to me a new thing, almost newer than the shift to online, which actually enables the second. But could you say a little bit more about that, how you do that? I think there's going to be a certain amount of awareness, perhaps, even though it's a very well-meaning thing.
Yeah, well, there probably is, but even visually, we can see into our own households now, can't we? And it's, we all shared the office space, and we knew, that, I don't know, Bob in finance was having an affair with Karen on the front desk or whatever. And, we all knew that in the office. We had an office ecosystem, and now it's a home ecosystem. We can't force people to tell us any more than they want to. We have to accept that they're going to be protective of their own family data. But with a call, you can see quite a lot, and you can ask them, and if they're struggling, hopefully draw it out of them. But I think the antennae of awareness need to be quite sharp, and I think a lot of the nuance of conversation that you get in an office is lost. When somebody just walks through the door and you think, they don't look so bright today, I'll go and ask if they're all right. We don't have those softer cues, so we're having to force ourselves to ask people to pick up on smaller signals, softer signals. Say, you all right? Is it working for you? Is there anything else we can do? And I think also, practical things. One company I spoke to, they had a team that wasn't very busy, and when one team that was doing client calls that needed to be focused was on, they were getting the team that wasn't busy to Zoom call with their kids and play games with them and entertain them, so the parents could focus on what they needed them to do. So potentially being a bit more creative about ways in which you might be able to help. I think it's making it okay to talk about it, probably.
Very nice. I like the two-speed point, which it seems to me you're saying, in the sense that on the one hand, we're going into people's houses. I'm sure I'm not the only person sitting here thinking, good, I wish I'd decorated before all this happened. At the same time, you're sort of saying, so it's less private. We're sort of seeing more of each other's homes, and that's that way it's sort of opening it up. At the same time, you're missing the visual cues, and I take that point completely. We could be doing a Zoom call for an hour and then going back, and as you say, perhaps mayhem of some sort ensues, and we won't be aware of that. So yes, that's a very nice nuanced point, I think. Excellent. Well, I think we've come to the end of the questions. Thank you ever so much for all those who asked. Thank you ever so much for those everyone attending, and perhaps above all, Christine, thank you. Very much appreciate it. Please show your appreciation in the reaction box. Look out for Christine's book, The Mother of All Jobs. Much recommended. Christine, did you want to come in? You look like you're...
Yeah, I was just going to say, if you want the survey results, just drop me a line or let Richard know, and I'll make sure that you get them. And lovely to talk to you. If you've got any follow-up questions, obviously don't hesitate just to drop me a line. I'm very happy to have a think about it.
Excellent, thank you. Thanks, Christine. Our next webinar is Wednesday, 29th of April at 2 o'clock with Geraldine Haley, looking at the case for a new leadership mindset, leading remotely. So please do drop us your answers to the two questions. Thanks to all those who have already. For now, thanks everyone, and we'll see you again. Cheers.
Thank you very much. Take care.